Um, well, someone's recording. That's good. Perfect.
Yeah, no, permissions have been a bit of a mess.
No worries. Yeah, as long as it
No,
works.
you guys are doing good, Pablo. It's yeah, it's a lot to orchestrate, and it's actually I think working quite well.
Exactly. So, I guess this should be enough of a quorum. Um, so I was trying to look up some of the studies that people have been doing, and I did not have to go very far. So currently, I'm based in Würzburg, and some of my colleagues here from the psychology department actually they are doing some interesting work, which is about the where they are trying to understand the power of prayer, which is not just for the self, but how does it actually work in a social context. And I think that's something which I personally found very interesting, and that's why I was anyways hanging out with them. But then when I try to understand how are they trying to measure these things, so how, okay, some people are in a room, they're praying, and what's happening to themselves versus how them going through the act of praying affects the other people within the room. And that was something which was done later on in a the classical psychological manner, which they had questionnaires and they filled in the questionnaires and did what the other people felt when they had this experience. But it was very hard for me to understand, okay, what do we take away from this? Because as we know, there are a lot of issues with self-reporting and things like that. So I'm happy to hear your points of views. Like, do these kind of studies actually go further than that? I mean, there are more studies as well, right? Like people doing MRI studies while monks are doing their meditation. So, but where do we go from that? So there is a lot of data available. One could throw a lot of algorithms at them, trying to understand. But does that really give us the kind of understanding that we're actually seeking? And that's something which I wasn't very convinced of. So I would like to hear what you guys might think about this. Anyone wants to go first?
I like the question. It's a good.
Right. Uh, Anyone? No. Okay, maybe a simpler question. Have you actually looked up such kind of studies? Like, have you come across such studies a bit?
I can share a little. I'm sort of hesitant too because it's sort of I'm trying to understand ways to answer this question. Is one of the two main reasons I wanted to come to this meeting, and I was so excited about it. And it's been very interesting, and I've learned a lot of things I didn't expect I'd learn. But it hasn't really quite done this, which is that's what life is like. It's okay. Um, uh, very, very briefly, my group, I talked a little bit about this yesterday, has been interested in taking one framework of complexity, which is dynamical systems, because it's fairly well formulated and it's been applied extensively. And it's a kind of lawful way to think about something, and you can sort of cut it up. It has this taxonomy, which makes it kind of utilitarian to apply to this phenomena. And it sort of seems intuitively reasonable. Um, and we then spent quite some time thinking about how would that framework conceptually help us to think about things like mindfulness meditation or cognition and so on. Wrote that, and then we started to read and reach out to many people, methodologists, mathematicians, different folks. So how do you actually do this?
Right.
And we came to basically two initial conclusions. I'm very happy to share this extremely concrete, very modest initial. Here are three or four categories of tools that maybe are relevant to capturing some of those features. One is it seems that there are real mathematicians which are swimming in non-conceptual differential equation space, and that is one way. And I don't understand. I actually don't. I don't get it. I don't know, but I think they do, and so I probably am the problem. And the other is folks who are doing things like applying. There's various ways of representing state space. state space grids is one example. There's a few of them. And you can represent attractors and repellers and generate metrics. So like that's a class. There are examples of you can quantify networks and networks in time, temporal networks, various kinds. That's an example. So there's a few of these categories that allow you to model quantitatively features of a dynamical system, assuming that you have data that is sufficiently high dimensional.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's
I-
helpful or not, but that's where we have that's where we are with it.
Right, right. But what I mean, again, like from what I understand, actually, from some of the studies, like yes, so there is a lot of data which comes through from some of these experiments, and which then one can use these tools from complex systems to try to get to some, let's say, like some kind of like attractors, let's say, which are really good to or not. I don't know. that's
Yeah, right. I don't know. Yeah,
that's
I
exactly
think
the
so. Yeah,
problem. I feel
useful,
like
right?
one could always. A colleague of mine once said, like, for biology, when with the genetics, I was like, the problem is there is always data, and then there is always some kind of answer which comes out of it, whether
Right,
whether
right.
it's whether what does it mean, and that's the question, I think, which is
Right.
very elusive at that point, and especially for for studying phenomena like mindfulness or meditation. What is the target? What is the goal that we are actually then looking for? Is a very hard thing to understand, because why would the individual be doing this? And then so where I come from, I try to put things more in a social perspective, and in that sense, for me, it was the question was also what are the other people getting out of this, and do they need to, like, what is actually happening between the humans at that point because of mindfulness happening in one person. And that was something that I was interested in. But again, so if that is a target, if that is a goal, then can one reach an understanding of that from looking at data, let's say from one person's brain activity? Or do you also have to have the observer's brain activity in parallel to connect the two? And
From my
so defining the
perspective,
question is a bit
yeah.
hard for me.
The reason one does mindful meditation is to be able to focus the mind on anything, and then one has to turn that to actually looking at awareness itself. So it's not the purpose of mindful meditation. It's not a thing, that's a thing in itself. It's part of a training so that you can actually experience the world from a non-dualistic perspective. And it's just the beginning of how one does this. So, so even if the mindfulness aspect will correlate to, how the brain synchronizes and all of that, that's not why you do mindful. I mean, at least from my perspective, why one is doing mindfulness meditation. One is developing a facility that then allows you to look at awareness itself, and then uh, eventually get into a there are various traditions with some kind of non-dualistic state. So without that facility, you can't you can't have that experience of non-duality. So yeah, so
So
I think yeah, so I just want to say, Fred, and I think this is happening a lot in this meeting, which I think is,
Mhm.
it's actually, I'm quite fascinated that it's happening, but I think in some way it's also a hindrance, because I think that there are different goals. And I think I see the discourse kind of keeps going back there, which is, I think you're totally right, but I think it's also worthwhile to hold for a moment how we as human beings use these practices and say, does complexity science as a lens allow us in a new way to look at these practices as objects of study? So, and it's not instead, it's so in other words, like, for example, might using some type of complexity science tool, I think is being asked here, through, for example, sensors or neural activity, allow us, for example, to have insight, conceptual insight about what non-dual states are. For example,
Mhm.
as a scientific question,
Is
even though
that
that's not the purpose of a non-dual state.
it's like
Right.
there are different levels of questions. One is it
Right.
even worth trying to come up with a science, a conceptual explanation of these practices? And just like it's a fundamental paradox, right? That if we're trying to be contemplative, we have to be non-dual, non-conceptual. If we're trying to do science, we have to be conceptual, right? But then, if we are somewhat, and that's kind of a big overarching question of today, right? But, if for a moment we assume that we are trying to be conceptual, then there is just a very pragmatic question of, okay, what does systems thinking and complexity science allow us? Like, what specific methods does it allow us to do that perhaps are being missed in the way that currently science is studying mindfulness?
Trying to study this. Exactly. And
Precisely.
trying to make the difference, for example, between what Fred you said, like, okay, so one can do mindfulness with, and then you train your brain to be better at being aware of of your surroundings, of oneself from inside and from the outside. So when we try to study mindfulness from a, let's say, from this lens of complexity science, or doing experiment, like doing empirical work on them, what is the hook? Like, what is the data that we are getting at? Would we ever get to this fact? So we might get data about, okay, the brain is acting in a very coherent fashion. Great. And then we can throw tools of complexity science on it to try to understand how it goes from one state to a state of very high awareness or coherence. And that's one aspect. But then exactly what you mentioned, what you do it for, so that you can get a feeling, the sense of non-duality, is that something which is tangible using dynamical systems then? And that I feel is like, though there is a slight disconnect between these two. Well, it's not a slight, it's actually quite a big disconnect between these two, because from a dynamical systems perspective, it's very hard to, or the mathematical machinery which that brings, it's very hard to tap into the second question that you talked about. Whereas the first one could be great. And even what we heard from Mike's talk today, maybe one can start thinking about, okay, maybe I don't need to do mindfulness. If I know what state of brain, what state my brain needs to be, can we engineer it? And then we go into that direction, right? Things like that. One could just work on this mechanical level, but will that give me the true experience? What you mentioned in the end. And that's this disconnect I feel exists, at what Pavel you said, in the current methods at least. And I'm not sure how dynamical systems still allows us to bridge. So when I say dynamical, of course, it's like the whole framework, right? I mean, it's this massive piece of machinery behind it. But how will it help us address exactly the second part? I'm a bit lost there. Yeah.
There,
The
the,
dynamical
I,
system itself is
sorry.
Xavier. No, please, Xavier.
Sorry. I was just going to say I don't have the answer. Also, my background's more like engineering and AI, which I think is overlapping with. I'm not a complexity scientist. I don't know the terms that people would refer to as using complexity science necessarily. But I thought maybe for this group, a book I read recently, and I think overlaps, because I think general systems theory feels very overlapped with complexity science to me. Joanna Macy, who just died, one of her early books is Mutual Causation in Buddhism and General Systems Theory. And that's a really interesting book to read because of the way it's trying to put a contemplative practice in direct dialogue with complex system science. And it's specifically looking at the doctrine of codependent arising in Buddhism, and this like sort of story of causation, which doesn't look like as temporal, A causes B causes C, but it's a little bit more, you've got a feedback loop, and then this thing kind of emerges in the network of relationships, which feels complexity E to me. So if y'all haven't seen it, I would suggest looking at that book as somebody who's like going very rigorously through both the sutras and systems theory texts, and trying to like talk about how you can use both. Precisely, yeah. Yeah.
For me, a perspective that comes up from complex networks is like I would guess like the look at two levels. Like one is like I'm also practicing mindfulness in a meditation, and I go to retreat centers, and I'm sure that many of you will witness that. Like for me, it's much more effective to be surrounded by people.
Right.
And this effect, like I was always curious about it. Like, well, what is the exact? Is it is there something which is synchronicity of the brainwave that we can track? And how is it like? What is the avenue that we can discover and make? Yeah, I, I I would be very interested to see research in this direction of
And I feel so going back to the like sorry for pushing one in that direction, because the reason also what I feel is like if you talk about the social aspect of it, it also automatically connects different scales, right? Because we are talking about mindfulness being what one is doing about the awareness of oneself, but one is also aware of other minds around you. And I think at least for organisms like us, maybe who are putting ourselves in other people's shoes quite often, this is something, an awareness of our surroundings, and not just non-biotic but also biotic, including other humans, and how that adds to our own I I I I can't pick the right word, but it kind of enhances our experience of the world around us, right? And I think it, as exactly as you said, like going, you could do it every day morning, sitting by yourself, beautifully by yourself, and meditating, and that's fine. But as soon as you do it also at the retreat, in a group, in a room full of people who are doing exactly that or trying to do, it's a completely different feeling. And what makes this difference? Can we then capture the scale or at which your brain is kind of working alone? And what happens when you do it, change the scale and working at the social level? And I think this connection
yeah.
between different scales of organization of what's happening in the more or less the same system kind of might tell us something more about about the process actually which it is going through during this either meditation or mindfulness practices.
Yeah, I'm almost
Yeah,
wanting to, go
please,
ahead.
please.
I'm
Yeah.
almost wanting to bring this also to like I'm aware that like the question that Ahmed is trying to get an answer to, right? Of like how do we use concrete method, right? I feel like we're also all kind of avoiding it by talking about the meta, but like what are the concrete perspectives? And I
Mm,
guess some of the talks, like I think from Adam Goldstein yesterday morning, the short talk about AI superorganisms and stuff, he definitely like he flashed some of the math, but they definitely in their research they have very concrete methods that I actually worked with some of those before, and we published with Eric before. So so that goes into some of the tools, but I think the sort of fundamental question of like, okay, what concrete methods can we use in a fruitful way. Um,
And to which data?
yeah,
Methods,
that
data.
too. Yeah.
yeah. And I'd say that, like, okay, the relation I see between like systems thinking. So like I have a lot of kind of criticism of the way that I see mindfulness research currently being done is that it's very simple systems, right? And so I think the first step is just to bring that systems awareness into that research, not necessarily specific formal tools, but just being like, don't test people, right? Like the example I like to give is, when they do mindfulness research interventions and like how it affects test results or something, I am sure nobody ever controls for the phase of the moon, right? And if you did, your paper would be rejected just for controlling for that, right?
Right.
But the
Yeah.
Buddhist tradition says you
Yeah.
absolutely have to control for the phase of the moon. So like, who are we to, right? And in some systems global sense, the phase of the moon, it changes how we relate to night, right? It can affect some group psychology, group thing, group feel, how light the nights are versus how dark they are can have an impact. And right, if we start thinking on systems level, on the interconnection level, it becomes less crazy to consider those influences and to actually at least be aware of them as you're doing this mindfulness research. And I think only once that becomes a little more established as a culture, oh, then we should think about these more formal mathematical methods of complexity science. I'd say like systems thinking is the more abstract thing, and complexity science is a more like mathematically formalized system science.
Mm,
Then we can think of these like data analysis techniques, like from that perspective, network studies, right? You can have these, yeah, mindfulness interventions individually, in groups, in different sorts of relationships, right? And look at the network effect of what social network the specific meditative person you are studying is embedded in, like how many of their
Mhm.
friends meditate versus not, etc., right? So there are these tools you can go into, but I think it rests on this like systems thinking foundation that is currently missing in that field.
Mm, mm,
I had, maybe this is maybe a provocation in the last couple of minutes, but uh, one of the ways I've heard actually at a retreat I was at with Pavel, one of the monks was, in his talk was talking very much about how the conceptual structures in Buddhism in particular are in particular they're designed. You're supposed to burn the boat when you get to the other shore is sort of what they say. That ultimately you're trying to get to this insight, this non-conceptual insight, this like insight of emptiness, and the tools that they are giving you, the conceptual tools that they're giving you, are just tools to get to the place where you release those concept structures. And one of the things you're saying is the danger is if you reify these concepts we're giving you, these concepts, the whole point is that these are the concepts for disentangling the other concepts. But if you reify these ones, you're kind of trapped because we have no tools left to disentangle them. So it just adds an interesting provocation. If we're trying to use these quantitative methods to study contemplation in some way, could we think of the methods less that we're trying to learn a fact? Can we think of them as processual in some way? Like what happens to us when we use complex systems methods to study mindfulness in this way? And does that shift us towards less suffering or more thought? And maybe it does, but like, could we try to figure out how to formulate the questions we ask with that kind of process goal in mind rather than the specific knowledge that comes from the tools?
I love that. I had the thought of like if you're trying to clean your hands and they're dirty with some mud, you might use other mud to clean the mud off, but you want the mud you use to be less sticky. So you might use sand, right? Which is a certain form of mud, but right.
mhm.
So it's like, is complex systems, is it less sticky than the predicament, the suffering we're in already? Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I have to say, like, I think I've had this experience in this meeting many times where I think, and I doubt I'm the only person who has this experience in the room, is that I feel like I don't really have some kind of fundamental knowledge and sort of philosophical understanding for quite a bit of the discourse, which is it's okay, it's interesting in and of itself, and I also think that um, some of this is just a way to a very sophisticated story to not actually do some concrete, simple things. And so um, the idea, like this, like mud on mud, yeah, but that's
Mhm.
science. Mud on mud is science. So we can say maybe we should have a meeting about whether there should be complexity science and maybe the meeting should be about whether there should be contemplative science.
Mhm.
But as far as I'm concerned, that isn't the meeting. That isn't the agenda. And I don't think that should be the agenda of the group. I think it's a fascinating question, genuinely. But like in my short lifetime and my like gig, like I'm curious for bigger minds to tell me what they think about that. I'm really open. But like I'm in the business of science, at least for now, even if it's just mud, more mud. Because at least, I think if everybody many people, my senses agree, people very thoughtful, look at things like meditation and say the way we're studying it is a distant proxy for what we actually think about it.
Mhm.
There are models that are a closer proxy. Let's use them and see what happens. That's my sense. And so, my aspiration, sort of hope for like what might emerge from a meeting like this going forward is okay, who wants to do that?
Mhm.
Who's
Mhm.
able to do that? Who understands
Right.
meditation in a unique way that can help? Who
Right.
can bring these conceptual frameworks like Pavel's talking about, and who actually has the math
Exactly.
knowledge?
Okay, so it closes soon. But I just wanted to say, like, I completely agree with you. I mean, so the idea is like, and the way I understood this meeting, at least, I mean, with Pavel and Robert and what they put together was like, it's a massive topic, and how to approach this massive topic. I mean, yes, we would want to kind of try to use the tools that we have, which is the scientific methods and other tools that we have, maybe they work, but maybe it would be even not, at least that's the way I get the meeting, is that it is worth having this discussion coming from the very broad perspective to see maybe in the end what are the smaller questions that one can actually then tackle with the methods that we have. And maybe in the I completely like, maybe in the end at some point we can put these things together, but I hope there are more people who want to do this. Thank you all who were in the breakout session. Thanks. I think it was quite exciting.
Very intense. Yeah. So yeah, any insights to share with the group? Like big picture?
Adam, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you. I guess for me, the insight is I was surprised and